see if this thing works. All right, and we're going to be looking at something that D.L. Moody called the telescopic method. Let's see if I can spell that. Telescopic method. Now, if you're wondering what that is when it comes to studying the Bible, it would be opposite of microscopic method. Microscopic would be, for instance, where you're going to stop at every word and consider that word. Telescopic would be a more wider look at the Bible, for instance. So years ago, my wife and I, we went to Big Bear to celebrate a wedding anniversary. And we were up there. This is long before Josiah came. So we're just cruising around Big Bear and having a good time and seeing kind of what are the sights, what are the things going on. And immediately we ran into a telescope group. And I'm like, a telescope group? Like, is this just a bunch of dorky people or something? And not, hey, if you're into telescopes, I'm not saying nothing, but we went over there, and the guy starts explaining to me why there's a telescope group in Big Bear. And I'm like, why is that? And he said the elevation at Big Bear is so high that when it's a clear night, you can see the stars, the planets, the moon, like no other place. I don't know if it's in California, in America, but it is a renowned place to look at God's handiwork, in the stars. And so we're sitting there, and these guys are starting to go to work on these. Some of them were manual, some of them were electronic telescopes, and they're getting them kind of focused on whatever they want to look at. Some were looking at like celestial bodies, some were looking at the moon, some were trying to find Saturn, things like that. And we're just standing out there in the cold, and me and Mary Chris, it took a long time for them to finally get these things set up, or it felt like that at least. Maybe it wasn't as long as I'm making it sound, but as you could imagine, if it's a little cold, you're like, oh, come on, please. But once they got these things set up, we could look at the moon and the other planets because it was such a clear night in Big Bear. And it was really amazing. We didn't think they were so dorky then, We're like, wow, these guys are actually pretty cool. And a lot of times going through life, we don't really take the time to stop and smell the roses. We don't really take the time to look at a sunrise or a sunset. We don't really take the time to even look up in the stars, maybe because you live in the city, but I know when we lived out at the Reno's property, that was a place you could look up and you could actually see something. But there was nothing for miles anyway. But so Big Bear, like I said, it's renowned for a place that you would want to look through a telescope at. But when studying the Bible, there are many methods that can be implemented. Yet one we've not yet looked at is what we're looking at today, the telescopic method. Now, essentially, this would be backing up. Instead of going word for word, you're backing up and you're more looking at the Bible as a book. So let's look now. I hope you're at Matthew 7. Let's go to Matthew 7. I don't hear any pages flipping, so I must be the only one not there. But I want to show you, before we get into this, that Jesus used this method. We're in Matthew 7, in verse 12. Somebody have that? Someone want to read that? Thank you.
Therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that man should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets.
Now, last time I checked, the law and the prophets had a lot more to say than that. Right? What did he do? He's summing it up in just a few words. You see? What's he doing? This is the telescopic method. You know, there's a lot to be gleaned when you back up off things and start looking around to find a theme. Let's try it again. Let's go to Matthew 22. Uh, 36 through 40 there. And I'll read this. It says, Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law? So he's pretty much asking for this. He's like, out of everything, what's the one? You know, like, let's just sum it all up in one. You know, and where are we at again? 36 through 40, right? Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. See that? So when you get looking into the 10 Commandments, essentially what Jesus is teaching you is the first half is Godward, you to God. And the rest is going to be you to your fellow man. What did he do? He just backed up and used this telescopic method. I'm trying to show you that it's a biblical method before we go into some other things. Let's look at this. John 1:17. John 1:17, it says, For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. What did he do there? He just summed up the whole Old and New Testament in one sentence. Law, Old Testament, grace and truth, New Testament. What is that? That's what we're talking about today. Well, was Jesus the only one that did this? What about Paul? Let's go ahead and go to Romans 13. In verse 9. Romans 13 and verse 9. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. If there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. See how he does that? Paul does it too, doesn't he? The beginning of the verse, he's clearly talking about the 10 Commandments. But he takes an aspect that Jesus Christ himself used, and he's using it as well. Let's see if he'll do it again in Galatians 5. That's a 5. It's an ugly 5, but it's a 5. We're in Galatians 5, and let's look at verse 14. It says, For all the laws fulfilled in one word, even this, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. All the law? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? Bam. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, as basic as that sounds, it can be hard to do, right? It can definitely be hard to do. But let's see if Paul does it again in 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy 1:5. First Timothy 1:5. It says, now the end of the commandment is charity out of a pure heart and of a good conscience and of faith unfeigned. They're all doing the same thing, you see. It's this method of understanding the Bible that you can't just come to very quickly. This is after years of study that you can now focus on a theme. You know, it's like you have that car, for instance. And if your cars are anything like my cars, it's like you know when the battery needs jumped, you know when you know how to wiggle